I'm guessing you need a higher mining level to even mine iron. Yeah, there's already an ad for your stream.
In 1933, a Russian cargo ship was tasked with making a groundbreaking trip across northeast Russia through the Arctic Ocean in hopes of establishing a permanent trade route known as the Northeast Passage. Like so many ships before it, it got stuck in the increasingly thick winter ice and was trapped for months at the mercy of the ocean currents below. Then, one day in February, there was a deep groaning from the ship's hull, and immediately
I was in the
Captain
mines
yelled for
really
everyone
quick.
to abandon the ship and get onto the ice. This is the story of the maiden voyage of the SS Chelyuskin.
I don't know how it kicked me off your stream, but it did. Yeah. I'm guessing I clicked a different person's video or something while trying to skip the ad.
Northern reaches of the map, the Arctic
Because then it sent me to a different
for the
YouTuber.
Russian people. Their exploration of the area dates back to 1648, when a small group of Cossacks sailed up the Bering Strait and around northeast
This is
Russia.
a good base.
This journey disproved the belief that Asia and North America were connected by land, but instead were
For
separated
now,
by
at least,
water.
it's a good.
And although a route across northern Asia,
It's
known as the
definitely
Northeast
not
Passage,
the best.
was yours for some time, this was more proof that a route by sea was potentially possible.
I'm guessing you already completely
Crucially,
rated
this
the
meant that there was a potential route that was much more direct from Europe to the
what is
Pacific
it
Ocean
called?
across the
The
Arctic.
little cities in the
For
water,
several centuries
little
afterwards,
castles.
the northern shores of Russia were
You
slowly
rated that one,
and several
probably.
different countries undertook expeditions, but these were hindered by these long, harsh winters and frozen water. Ships would often get stuck in the ice and be forced to spend the winter until thawing out many months later. Several centuries later, after the Russian Revolution in 1917, and under the new leadership of the Soviets, Russia established a series of ambitious plans and goals
I
nationwide.
grabbed.
One of these goals
had
was a
purified
focused expansion
water.
of what was named the Northern Sea Route. Siberia had since been realized to be extremely resource-rich, and this route would help facilitate the transfer of people and goods across regions, and eventually across the
Right
entire
there in the
Russian
chest
nation
I was
from
looking
west
at.
to east. However, as with previous expeditions and exploration,
Yeah, I
this
know,
route
I
crosses
took some of
many
them.
icy seas on the northern shores.
There.
So to do this,
Seven.
they used the fairly recently invented icebreakers, which are ships made
I
with
have
reinforced
two.
hulls and in a shape that helps split the ice. In addition to these icebreakers, aircraft began to be used.
I
around
grabbed
this time,
them because
and
I'm
planes
like,
would
I
be
need 'em.
stowed on deck and then hoisted onto makeshift
Nope,
runways
that
against
bug
the
can
ice.
stay out there.
The
I do
planes
not
would
want
then
to
fly
deal with
ahead
it.
and scout the safest route for ships. By the end of the 1920s, both pilots and ships were becoming famous in Russia for this exploration, and the Soviet government was taking the northern routes more seriously. Then, in 1932, the Soviet leadership set up an Arctic Commission to explore the region in as much detail as possible. The head of this commission was appointed Professor Otto Schmidt, who was a professor of mathematics at Moscow State University, a skilled geographer, and the director of the State Publishing House for Scientific Literature. He also happened to be a keen mountaineer and had led several expeditions to Franz Josef Land, which is an archipelago in the Arctic Ocean, to establish a scientific research station. During these expeditions, much like he had come to love mountaineering, Otto also grew to love the Arctic. Later that year, Otto was tasked with the first ever crossing of the Northern Sea Route in a single season. This plan called for him to take a ship from Murmansk on the northwestern shore all the way across Russia, then down through the Bering Strait to the shores north of Japan. For this trip, Otto used an icebreaker and was successful despite its propeller shaft breaking apart on the way. Incredibly, using an improvised sail, the expedition successfully finished the final leg of the voyage. For the Soviet government, this was proof that the route was feasible. The problem that still remained, however, was that most icebreakers either weren't made for long distance travel or weren't big enough to carry much cargo. So even if a route was technically possible, it still might not accomplish the goal of establishing a proper trade route. So next, in 1933, Otto was tasked with repeating this journey, but this time with a brand new cargo vessel, the SS Chelyuskin. The Chelyuskin had just been built and was much stronger than most cargo vessels. Otto even called it a semi-icebreaker. The hull was specially designed and reinforced. It was twice as powerful as a standard cargo ship, and its cabins were built to withstand the cold in case it got stuck over winter. At the same time, it was still never intended to do something as challenging as a long Arctic trip. And despite how powerful it was, it didn't have the horsepower to break through thick ice like an actual icebreaker. Even still, it was the best option available at the time. For this second crossing, along with Otto, was the same captain as the year before, The ship then officially began its voyage on July 12, 1933, from what was then known as Leningrad, which today is modern-day St. Petersburg. They reached Copenhagen on the 16th, and along the way calibrated the new ship's engine. After Copenhagen, the ship continued on to Murmansk for its last stop before making the crossing. Finally, they sailed from Murmansk on August 10th to make a trip across the Arctic. The route across northern Russia takes ships through a series of 6 different seas. The Barents Sea, which first was a smooth ice-free crossing. This is typically the least treacherous among them because it stays warmer due to the influence of the warm North Atlantic current. The Kara Sea, which is next, wasn't as forgiving. The first time the Chelyuskin hit the ice, plates on the stern bent in, cracking part of the hull.
Good.
This wasn't enough to end the voyage, but it wasn't encouraging either, considering the ice would only get worse. But this bad news was quickly followed by good news. Just before the ship reached an area known as Cape
Right, I'm just making sure my spawn point's
crew members on board gave birth to a daughter. She was named Karina. About a month later in September, the Chelyuskin became one of 11 ships that passed the Cape just that year. In contrast, before 1933, only 9 ships had ever gone that way, showing just how focused the Soviet leadership was on opening that route.
Oh, do you have
In
a
addition, all
quick
the other
bet,
vessels that
I'm
year
guessing?
had icebreakers, so despite the damage in the Kara Sea, the Chelyuskin had already made an impressive journey. After passing the Cape, the ship entered the Laptev Sea.
Do
and
you
then
have
the
one of
eastern
those
Siberian
things
Sea, which
playing
were already
the audio?
90 to 100% covered in ice. Thankfully, because it was still fall though, it was thin enough for the Chelyuskin to push through, and any of the damage was minor enough that it could be repaired. When they reached the Chukchi Sea though, which is the last stretch before entering the Bering Strait, things began to look much worse. This was where the ship on the previous expedition broke its engine, and ice was even thicker this time around. The Chelyuskin continued to push through the ice for a time, but they speed up slower and slower. Frustratingly, at one point, they took an airplane up and found open water just 16 miles away. But by then, it was too late. On September 21st, the Chelyuskin ground to a halt. The ship was officially trapped in the ice, and its rudder was bent by 20 degrees. All the boat could do was drift eastward the ice to a bay northeast of the Bering Strait. That particular bay runs deep into the mainland, and sea currents push ice floes into it, smashing them together and compacting the ice.
If you can't find it, you
It's
could make
also an area
one.
that's prone to whiteouts, so using their plane or getting to them by plane was next to impossible. So, with no other options, the crew resigned themselves to having to wait until the weather improved and focused on other work. A little over a week later, on October 1st, Otto heard a sound in the distance. Through the whiteout, he could hear dogs in the distance barking and howling. At first, this was faint, but the noise kept getting louder and louder until dog sleds appeared out of the mist. It was a party of Chukchis.
Oh, we should totally get a wool from the blimp.
Apparently, after one of them had spotted the stranded ship, they launched a rescue party and made a journey of 25 kilometers by dog sled to get out to them. Otto then asked a crew member who spoke their language to go to shore with him. The Chukchis offered to take as many people as they could down the Bering Strait, where they knew an icebreaker known as the Litki was moored. Unfortunately, with only a few dog sleds, they would only be able to take a few of the over 100 crew. It was also a journey of more than 330 kilometers through frozen Siberia as winter was fast approaching. Because of this, Otto chose to send one man who was close to passing away unless he saw a doctor right away, and 6 other men he'd promised to send back to their day jobs if the ship got stuck.
Thank you.
After the natives left, and in order to make it through the long winter, Otto began preparing to build a base nearby the ice.
Yeah.
But then, on October 5th,
It's because it was heating me up.
Where they were setting up.
So I'm
Men
just
who were outside working only just
on
managed
fire
to
half
send
the
one of
time.
their tools before the water surrounded the ship once again. Incredibly, the Chelyuskin was moving again, and even better, while it had been stuck in the days before, they
I'm
managed to
going
repair
back in the
rudder as
base.
well. Instantly, the crew's morale lifted, and an air of relief spread throughout the boat, only to be crushed again a few hours later when the ice retook its hold. From this point onward, they would be at the mercy of the ice and the water currents below it. For more than a month, the Chelyuskin drifted in circles with ice at the mouth of the Bering Strait, and no one on board had any idea if or where they might get free. On November 3rd, the ice they were trapped in actually floated into the strait, but they were still stuck. Several times, they even floated south past the St. Diomede Islands, at the midpoint between Alaska and Russia, before being dragged back up north by the powerful Pacific Current. On one of these cycles, this movement north was so rapid that Otto was
I'll
worried
keep
that
it as an
there was a good
offhand
chance
weapon
they would
because I
be
do
dragged
have
into
this.
the Arctic Circle. That
It does
meant
more
they wouldn't get
damage.
free within the year, and the ship itself was at risk from the weight of the ice.
and can disarm
Now,
enemies.
Otto
so that's
had
actually
previously
really
contacted
useful.
the Litki to ask for help, but when he had, they explained to him they had their own problems. Their engines weren't running at full power, so icebreaking was difficult.
And lesser
if not
smite is
impossible.
for zombies.
On November
stuff, so
10th,
I'd
though,
probably
with the
use
situation
it
getting
until
much more
it
dangerous,
breaks.
Otto sent a message begging the Litki for help. He knew it was risky for them, but he felt he had no choice. However, despite the condition of the
I do
ship,
have a
the captain
backpack,
lit
but right now I don't have enough items for me to
At
want
first, he
to
tried to
carry
go
it on
directly
my
to
back
the
right
ice,
now.
but that was too much for the half-powered ship. They then tried going around one side of the ice sheet where the edge was close to the Chelyuskin, but that also didn't work. Quickly, conditions worsened and the ice got thicker and wider. The captain of the Litki then suggested they moor at the edge of the ice and the crew of the Chelyuskin walk over, but by then, there was 50 kilometers between them. Otto just couldn't risk that. Another option was to fly people over, but when the plane tried to take off, it skidded on the ice and was damaged beyond repair. This
Literally
was
just by wearing my
unfortunately their
pants,
last
I'm
resort,
already,
so with a
like,
heavy heart, Otto then
you know, like
told the Litki
the
to
heat
stop
you would
trying to
normally
reach them.
get when you're in the desert.
While all this was happening, the ice floe they were trapped on had been traveling in all directions, sometimes west, sometimes east. For a while, it even seemed to stop near the coast of the Chukchi Sea. Then, in December, the ice even melted enough for them to get underway.
Like I
just
am in
before
real
it
life
wasn't
right
long
now.
before they got stuck again. By then, the sun had set for the last time, and they would have to endure months of darkness and long polar nights.
Yeah, this will do.
Incredibly, this was also the least of their problems. When the route was planned, Otto and the team never anticipated spending the entire winter on the boat. This meant they had to keep the ship warm for longer than expected, which also meant the amount of coal they had wasn't sufficient for the entire duration, and if they weren't careful, they'd run out entirely. So next, it was the job of the first-class mechanic on board to bring consumption down. First, he gave bonuses to the engine stoker to use the least coal. Then he tried cutting off the heating for 8 hours daily, but this caused dampness to form in the walls of the living quarters, so he tried switching the heating for 2 hours at a time instead.
Well, I'm
Then
trying
he
to
came
cool
up with the
down
idea
a
of
little
developing
bit.
new fuel
Alright,
using a mix of
goofy
paraffin,
things.
crude oil, waste oil, animal fats, and anything else they had available. This proved to be enough to warm the essential areas and reduce the coal they were using, but either way, their coal consumption would continue to be a problem.
I can't even find
The other
what you
problem
were
they had that
looking
was
at.
water. They'd run out of water in late November, and by the end of December, they had to melt ice for drinking water. Afterward, quite a few crew members were tasked with gathering ice to bring back to be melted in a boiler. But as time went on and the crew solved some of the more pressing issues, they began to settle into their new life and even enjoyed some aspects of it, as weird as that might sound. They used the skis they had on board to scout for suitable spots for planes to land, and in their downtime, they'd even use them to
How
ski
am I
for leisure and found
still
rocky
hot?
outcroppings to ski and jump off of. Several crew members even marked out a course around the ship using flags for racing. They also
It
engaged
must be
hunting
that the
competitions and
hot in here as
Otto
well
would
because
lecture
of
and
lava,
latest
even though
scientific
it's
theories,
blocked
followed by
off
singing
lava.
and music from anyone who brought an instrument. By February of 1934, they drifted right into the middle of the Chukchi Sea.
Did you
Over
loot
winter,
that
the
one
ice
structure
continued
that
to
has
get
the,
thicker and heavier each day, and Otto
one
knew
big
it
dude
was
in
only a
it?
matter of time before the ship itself would be in serious trouble.
No?
Then on
Is the
February
dude
12th,
still
the
alive
ship's
in there?
engineer took his team to inspect the hull because the ice had been jolting the vessel more than usual. Now, even
Really
though
wanna
there's
fight a sea
24 hours
dragon
of
right
night
now?
in the polar winters, there's still an hour or so of dark
Okay.
twilight where it's not pitch black
That makes it
outside.
a little nicer.
During this hour, the men descended from the ship in a negative 40-degree blizzard and walked the length looking for any damage. Luckily, they didn't find any, but they
Yeah,
did
we're gonna
find
go
that a
around
crack
it,
had
make
formed
sure
in the
it
ice on
stays
the
on
front
nice.
right-hand side of the ship. This might seem like good news,
Why am I
but the
still
engineer
hot?
knew it meant the colossal ice sheets were shifting and would soon put even more pressure on the Chelyuskin's hull. The following day at 1 p.m., shocks began to shake the ship.
I am
Then,
just
when they
burning
followed the
up.
crack in the ice widened, the ice began to press into the vessel.
Wearing armor,
First,
not
of course,
wearing
the
armor,
Chelyuskin
doesn't
passed the
matter.
distance it could go, but then, when there was no more space, it was pinned even tighter in the ice. After that, the ice began to crush the ship, squashing the
I
engine
got
and
it.
some of the bunkers on the vessel's right side. The plates on the upper deck began to bulge and then burst while the crew was thrown around by one violent jerk after
It seems to
another.
be going after
This
me.
was followed by the Chelyuskin starting to tip over to the left. Then, for a moment, everything seemed to calm down. Otto had already organized emergency storage to be put on deck in case something like this happened, so he ordered everyone to help move the supplies onto land. They used
I'm
this
literally
leftover
just
meat
trying
lay
to cool
planks
down.
on the side
That
so
is
they could
it.
slide supplies down before dragging them to a tent that had been put up days earlier. Once that was done, everyone had just 5 minutes to get their personal belongings. An hour and a half after the first crush,
Why am
a
I not
violent shudder
cooling
hit the
down?
vessel. Another part of the ship caved in, then a series of small jerks, one after the other, rocked the boat as water burst from one part of the ship to the next. This extra weight then pulled the ship's
And all the
bow
creatures are
under the sea, and water
frozen.
began to
Well,
rush
no.
over the front bow.
Cooled down
In
now,
the
so
chaos,
I'm still
they sent
on.
one last radio message before dismantling the radio equipment and sending it off the ship. Then Otto and the captain ordered all but essential personnel onto the ice. At the same time, he and the captain and a dozen other crew members began throwing anything of use from the deck. They tried to round up the animals they'd taken on board, but in the chaos, the animals ran wildly. The only choice they had was to slaughter them and throw their carcasses overboard to be eaten later. Water then began to cover the passenger deck and
I
the
can't
ship
wait for it
tilted
to be
forward.
wintertime and I'm
The
worrying
captain
about
then shouted
being...
for everyone to get onto the ice, and everyone made a run for it. Otto and the captain then made it to the gangway, but only just, and as they ran along the passenger deck, the upper deck even broke above them. A plank broke from the gangway stairs and knocked the captain off the ship and onto the ice. Meanwhile, anyone left on board at this point poured out and jumped from wherever they could, disregarding the height of the fall to the ice below. Finally, the only man left
right
on
here
board was
now.
the quartermaster. He ran over, making it to the center ship, but then just as he began stepping over, the vessel flipped with such force that the engine and rudder were pushed
Does
out
a
of the
shield
water
block
into
its
the air.
attack?
Any remaining store barrels and what was left on the upper deck then fell onto him, knocking him out. A few seconds later, the Challeuskin disappeared into the water, and the crew could only watch as it dragged their quartermaster down with it.
Oh,
After
yeah,
watching the
for you.
horrific scene unfold, the crew were tired, shocked, and scared. Otto decided the best thing to do would be to set up the radio tent, then their living tents, then have something to eat, and then get some sleep for the night. After doing exactly that, they woke up in the morning of February 14th and assessed their situation. The good news was that quite a few extra supplies,
It was mainly
fuel
after
barrels,
you,
and building
so I
materials
just
floated up from the ship's wreck. For the first few
went
days,
after
Otto
it
put the
from
crew to work
behind.
fishing out whatever they could, and they also got the radios working, and when they radioed home, a plan
do
was
you
made
want
to
the
mount
sea
a rescue.
serpent stuff?
A government commission decided that the best plan was to
I
get
need
as
to
many
jump
of
in
them
the
as
water.
possible by air while providing dogs, sleds, and air support for the rest. At this point, the crew was stranded 80 miles or 130 kilometers from the coast. The nearest town was
Yeah.
Cape Van Karum, so the crew would be taken there and then to Alaska before traveling
here's
back to
your
Russia via
shield.
London and Berlin. At
Here's
least
the
that
Red
was the
Sea
plan.
Serpent
In order to
thing.
make this rescue possible, their first task would be to build an airstrip in the ice for planes to land on. This became the main focus of work in the camp, as they used whatever resources they had to make the landing as safe as possible. They also knew it would be some months before being rescued, so they had to keep the airstrip in good condition. In fact, this was exceptionally challenging due to the shifting ice. 13 times the ice under the runway broke, and each time the whole operation base had to be either patched up or moved entirely. While this was happening, Otto was coordinating the rescue and was busy figuring out who would fly out and who would be traveling by dog sled. Some of the women on the trip were annoyed to find out that he'd given them seats on the plane, along
You
with
died
4 children
quick.
and those who showed signs of illness.
What did you do? Just
The reason
attack
they were
it
annoyed
straight
was
up
that they'd
and
been
just
working
killed
just
you?
as hard as the men and thought other, weaker members should take their place, but Otto was adamant. The planes were to take the women,
Got
children,
it. I
and
just
sick.
killed it while it was
Until then,
fingered
all
on
they
you
did
for
was focus
shooting
on
it
keeping
so
the airfield in one piece and wait. They came to call this temporary home Camp Schmidt.
Well, that one was a littler
Unfortunately,
one, and the
flying to Camp
littler
Schmidt
ones are the
proved to
ones
be
that get
almost
stuck
as
on the
dangerous
line.
as sailing
The
through the
bigger
Northern
ones don't.
Passage. On February 14th, so the day after the
As
Challeuskin
often,
sank,
at
a
least,
pilot
in my
named
opinion.
Sigismund Levanevsky was listening to his radio when he heard what had happened. He was a well-known and well-respected pilot, and he suspected
You wanna go to
they would
that
be using
wooden
the aircraft
house
to get
over
the Chicago
there?
crew. He then telegraphed Moscow, offering his services, and the following morning he was contacted
I'll
and told
just
he would
go
be
in
part of the
between the
special
two.
mission. He was then filled in on the details of the rescue operation and their takeoff point in Alaska. Thankfully, this was still pre-Cold War, and the Americans were happy to lend the Russians a couple of planes to help save their men. Afterward, a coordinated effort was
Okay, the
undertaken
house
for
is
precise
just a
rescue.
dirt house.
This meant getting everything in place as quickly as possible, so that by
What?
the time they were ready to launch, it wasn't too late in the spring when the ice would begin to break up and the planes could no longer land. Sigi was then sent to Fairbanks, Alaska, with a man named Georgy Ushakov, who was an experienced Arctic explorer who was going to coordinate the rescue. Then, on March 26th, everything was set, and Sigi took his plane to the skies for the first time.
Oh, before you
The
went.
plan was to cover 500 miles and reach the town of Nome on the Alaskan side of the Bering Strait. As they made their way through, suddenly their
I'm over
speed
to
began to drop
defend you,
as
I
if the
guess.
wind was slowing them down. Sigi then radioed back and asked what the weather was like ahead, and in response, he was told there was a blizzard starting ahead, forcing them to turn around and wait for better weather. 2 days later, the plane took off once again, but this time they didn't even know what the
I
weather
can
was
do
because the
very
weather
little
station wasn't
cooking
functioning
at that
properly.
time.
But it was now or never because the ice was weakening day by day.
Well, I guess I did
Continued on,
already.
the conditions were okay at first, but eventually the snow got worse and the clouds got so thick that Sigi had to fly low enough to use telegraph poles to guide him into the landing strip at Nome. By some miracle, he managed to bring the plane down, and after landing in Nome, the next step was to fly over the Bering Strait to Cape Van Karum, which is on the far eastern tip of Russia. The plane set off once again the next day, and because the weather stations were working again, it sounded like it would be an easy flight. They flew over the strait and then along the Russian coastline, and everything was
Yeah,
fine
with your
until they got
fist,
to the
I believe.
Chukchi Peninsula. At that point, visibility was reduced to almost zero, and Sigi dropped low to see if he could find somewhere to land. After finding nothing, he took the plane back up to 5,000 feet and carried on flying with only his eyesight and his compass to guide him. Then, the clouds
You
became a
want to sleep
snowstorm,
away this
causing the
night
plane
before
to shake violently.
too many mobs
Then,
spawn?
as they continued, Sigi noticed a film of ice had formed around the windows. Almost simultaneously, Georgie passed him a note saying the whole plane was covered in ice. Siggy then tried to climb over the storm, but as they ascended, the air was colder still, and the plane got heavier and harder to steer. Soon enough, the engines began to backfire, and before long, all the instruments froze. This meant he had no idea how fast he was going or what altitude he was at, but carefully, he altered the plane's course to take him away from a hilly area. It was only a matter of time before they went down, and he could tell they were dropping in altitude. All he could do was find as level ground as possible to land the plane. Finally, they reached the coast, and he could make out the ice floes down below them. He then turned back toward the mainland as best he could, and as they approached what he thought must have been ground, Siggy pulled back on the controls as hard as possible to avoid smashing nose first into the ground. Siggy was then overwhelmed by the sound of metal scraping on the ice, and then everything went dark. When Siggy finally came to, Georgie was shaking him desperately and asking him if he was still alive. Georgie then managed to pull Siggy from the cabin and bind the deep gash he'd gotten on his head. After the crash, Georgie's knowledge of the Arctic saved their lives, along with the lucky location of their crash. They had landed in the same bay that the Chelyuskin had gotten stuck in several months earlier. The two men were then able to stay with some of the locals and even arranged to be taken to Cape Van Karum by dog sled the next day. And thankfully, these subsequent flights by other pilots had more luck. As the two men traveled by sled, another pilot flew overhead in a plane that the Americans had lent him. The weather had cleared by then, and he made it to the landing site in a nearby town without incident. This clear window didn't last long, and the weather stayed bad until April 7th, but when the snowstorms ended, he and the other pilots flew up to meet Georgie at Cape Van Karum. As soon as he landed, Georgie had him unload his cargo and take 8 dogs and a dog sled for the crew who would be airlifted. Before the weather could turn again, they took off toward Camp Schmidt and landed at the icy airstrip a few hours later. After offloading the dogs and sled and patching up the aircraft, he took off with a group of passengers back to Cape Van Karum.
Wyvern, I believe, above us.
After this first successful landing, he was one of 7 pilots, including Siggy, who flew back and forth between Van Karum and the makeshift airstrip, getting 55 people to safety that April by plane. Everyone else was then successfully transported by dog sled, and despite being trapped in the ice for 8 long months, just one person died in the expedition. That was the quartermaster who had gone down with the ship. After the rescue, the pilots involved were given the title Hero of the Soviet Union. Soviet leadership also considered the trip successful, as they'd reached the Bering Straits and they went on to develop stronger cargo ships and started shipping on that route in 1935. However, even today with modern ships and icebreakers and even the changing climate, the northern sea route isn't nearly as consistent as other routes due to ice, extreme weather, and the lack of infrastructure through the Arctic. In 2006, fragments of a ship found 50 meters under the Chukchi Sea were confirmed to be that of the Chelyuskin.
I was trying to cool down.
If you made it this far, thanks so much for
watching.
watching.
That house is empty.
Story suggestion, feel free to submit it.
Yeah, see what I mean?
Description.
And then there was a
I will see
fish in here that was trying to attack me at the same time.
In 1845, 2 ships entered the dark waters of the frozen and barren Canadian archipelago in search of an elusive
I'm 1 health
northwest
down,
passage.
but I have like
At the
3
large mouth
different
of the
damaged
channel, they
body
were met by
parts.
2 whaling ships who saw them off shortly afterward. These would be the last individuals
And I
to see
keep
ships
forgetting that
ever again.
technically
For
you
over
can
a
only
century,
need to take
their
3
whereabouts
hearts
remained
of
a
damage.
mystery.
You're
Slowly
dead.
over the past few decades, what happened to these
Half the
ships
time,
and the men
at
on board
least.
has been discovered, and it is far more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. This is Franklin's Lost
They
Expedition.
could just see the
As
chaos
always,
that's happening
viewer discretion is advised.
while they're listening to something.
Living in the mid-1800s must have felt similar to the digital boom of the 90s and 2000s or the post-war economy and tensions of the 1950s. Because in just a few short decades, everything had changed. The Enlightenment and the end of the Napoleonic Wars had set a new way for much of the world. Steam engines had kick-started the Industrial Revolution, and for the first time in human history, we were close to having a map of the entire world. But to finish it, there was one final prize that eluded everyone who had tried. This was the Northwest Passage. At the time, England and many of the other world powers had been spreading their influence through trade and empire, but the shape of the Americas was a natural barrier to sea travel. Since the technology to create something like the Panama Canal wouldn't exist for some time, that meant that ships would either have to take the long way down around South America, then all the way back up the Pacific, or sail the other way around the globe. Either way, it was quite the journey. So the chance, however small, that a path might be found through the frozen Northwest Territories of Canada was too much for the British Admiralty to give up. And even if it did prove impossible for trade, the prestige of filling in the last navigable waterway on Earth was enough of a prize
do you want to go
that
to
some
the
people
sky
devoted their
thing?
entire
Or
careers
no?
to it. Like, for example, Sir John Barrow, second Secretary of the British Admiralty,
No.
aged 81 at the time, saw this as a chance to put one last grand feather in his cap before retirement. So he ordered a final expedition to be assembled and set out to choose its leader. Barrow's first two choices
They
had
could
both
have,
declined,
like,
one of
medicine
which was
stuff,
William
I
Parry,
guess.
who had
That's
grown
the
tired of the
only good
Arctic,
thing.
and the wife of the other, James
I guess
Ross,
they have
convinced him not
crops
to
in
go.
that one that we could
The
break.
third choice, Francis Crozier, was passed over by the Admiralty for being an Irishman of low birth. Then the fourth choice,
Right.
James Fitzjames, was seen as too young and inexperienced to lead such an undertaking. So finally, the fifth
I
choice,
forget what
the man the
farming
expedition
level
would be
you
named
need
for, was Sir John Franklin. This would actually be Franklin's third attempt to find a passage, having done so by
you
seeing
only
Red
need
Land
level
with
2.
mixed success. His previous attempt had even led to the deaths of half his
Okay, I'll
men,
go
with the
this way.
survivors resorting to eating moss and leather to avoid starvation. Afterward, Franklin returned in shame, known as the man who ate his boots. In spite of that, though, Franklin was well liked by his men, and he was known to be kind and cared for their well-being, sometimes leading them in sermons and going out of his way to ensure their safety. He was also known to be a little overly enthusiastic and had previously gotten carried away when a goal was in front of him, rushing to the finish rather than doing things carefully. But a combination of care for his men in a dangerous place and the enthusiasm to see it through to the end wasn't necessarily a bad thing, and thankfully, he wouldn't be doing it alone. Although they were deemed
I really
inadequate
want to
to
run
lead the
into one of
expedition,
the
Francis
little,
Crozier and James Fitzjames would be
the
joining
little
Franklin
nymphs
as
that
his
heal
second
you.
and third, and would be the captains of two ships under Franklin's command, called the Terror
I
and the
don't know if we want
Erebus.
to go near it.
For the ships, there would be no expense spared and no cutting-edge technology
At
left
this
out.
point,
The
we
lead
really
ship,
shouldn't.
the Erebus, was a Hecla-class bomb vessel commissioned in
Right.
1826 and 105 feet
Could go
long.
to the
The Terror was a little
island there
older
in
and
that
smaller,
middle,
was a
or the little
Vesuvius-class bomb
underwater
vessel from
area.
1813 and 102 feet long.
I don't think that's good
Both
enough
ships were
with
chosen
the
because bomb
danger it
vessels
could
were meant to
cause.
fire heavy mortar from their decks, so they had extra cross
But
bracing.
sometimes there's really
That
good
also
loot in
allowed them
there.
to better withstand breaking through the ice in the north. But
I
all of
guess
that
there
was
is
just
a little
standard.
farm in
In
there
addition
that
to
we
that,
could
portions of the ship's wooden hulls had been doubled
grab
in
some
thickness,
stuff
with
from.
even more iron sheeting added to the bows and along the waterline for the expedition. Both ships also received vents for internal heating, as well as a brand new addition no ship in the Royal Navy had ever possessed before, which was a propeller. And not just that, both ships could even retract their propellers and rudders in recesses on the underside of their hulls to protect them from the ice. To power this newly added propeller, each ship carried a converted locomotive steam engine from the London and Greenwich Railway to drive the ships even in the absence of wind. These motors also required roughly a ton of fresh water per hour, spurring another invention to be included, which was desalination equipment to turn seawater into fresh water. The expedition would also bring with it one of the first types of photographic cameras ever to be sold to the public, called a daguerreotype camera. They also even had an insulated diving suit on board if ice ever needed to be removed from rudders or propellers. These features are obviously commonplace today, and the Arctic is largely known about, but to the men actually going on the expedition, it might have felt like going to space. Only 6 of the expedition's 24 officers had been to the Arctic before, and to anyone seeing it for the first time, it might as well have been another planet. Compasses would shift and wander because of how close to the pole they were. Months could pass without the sun setting or rising. The entire ocean turns to solid most of the year, and the land is so barren that you will only ever see white snow, gray rocks, and dark blue waters. On the 19th of May, 1845, the Erebus and Terror set sail to Greenhithe, just east of London, and began their journey. Between them, they carried 134 men, a ship's cat, a dog named Neptune, a monkey named Jack, which was a gift from Lady Franklin, 2 tons of tobacco, 7,500 liters of liquor, around 12,000 books, theater costumes, sports gear, and one more brand new invention critical to the mission, which was 16,000 tin cans of food. These included fruit and vegetables to stave off scurvy and would for the first time comprise nearly all of an expedition's rations. The ship set sail up, stopping at Stromness in Scotland, and then across the Atlantic to Whalefish Islands on the west coast of Greenland, with 2 other ships accompanying them. The 2 ships would then top up the supplies of the Terror and Erebus before departing back to England and leaving the expedition on their own.
I am back.
While they were on the islands, 5 members of the expedition would also be discharged and sent home after falling ill during the Atlantic crossing. Before the expedition set off again, the crew spent a few days ashore, where they wrote their last letters home and enjoyed what relative warmth they could. In the letters, they said the officers had already begun their scientific work tracking the weather and other natural phenomena. Franklin
That's
going
to be a strange point in the stream with no context.
How effective that would be with the sailors. But overall, the crew was confident and excited. They were about to step off on the adventure of a lifetime and mark their names in the history books. The expedition set sail once again on the 12th of July, 1845, with 129 men aboard.
That structure
2 whaling
can have
ships
some
met
good
up with
stuff,
them in Baffin Bay, waiting for an opening in the ice, before seeing them
no
off
XP
into
or
a large
anything,
channel
though.
known as Lancaster Sound. This
Still knows
was
the
the last
import
time the
frame
Franklin
stuff.
expedition was ever seen alive. After entering the channel, they just vanished, and it would take over
Yay, I'm getting
150
timed out
years
again.
and dozens of expeditions and investigations to piece
Because
together
you're still
facts.
rowing, right?
These investigations are even still ongoing, but here is what we do know. Sailing was slowing north. Even during the summer, most channels are packed with ice, and the ships need to push floating chunks of ice out of the way as they progressed. If this was done too quickly, this would gradually damage the ship's bows and potentially sink them. This would
Yeah,
also show one of the first nails in the expedition's coffin, which had always been there, it just hadn't been
I
realized.
know, I saw the
Steam
wasp.
engines carried by both ships, which powered their revolutionary.
Why did you stop
One
like
was
that?
25 horsepower, 4 knots. This was only a tenth of the power of ice tankers, less than half their size at the time. This feature was the mystery, as the Admiral only included 12 days worth of fuel for the steam engines, which
Mother-
was much better used for heat than propulsion. It's likely that these were seen as more of a psychological benefit to the crew and to the British public, and were only of very limited use. As a result, the expedition would only travel around 800 kilometers, navigating around Cornwallis Island, before circling back to Beechy Island by the first winter freeze. This put them only around 350 kilometers.
I don't think we should have played around like that. I wasn't even in first person. You actually